Okay, so today we're diving into something I think a lot of people find kind of boring. Web terms of use and privacy policies. You know those things we all scroll to the bottom of and click agree without even looking? But well, today we're going to find out why we should actually be paying attention to this stuff. It's way more interesting than you might think, and especially relevant here in Australia. You've sent over some great info from Now Technology Systems. So let's unpack why these policies are so important.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is these policies are basically like the rule book for the entire internet. Every time you go on a website, you're stepping into their digital space.
Yeah.
And these policies really set the stage for how you can interact with them, but also importantly, how they interact with you.
So it's kind of like walking into a store. There's certain expectations and rules, even if they're not, written on a giant sign.
Exactly. And the first thing you encounter when you step into this digital space are the terms of use. And these terms of use lay down the law, what you can do, what you can't do, what the website's responsible for, what they're definitely not.
So it's not just them covering their behinds. There's actually more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. One really crucial aspect of these terms of use is about protecting intellectual property. Think about those viral memes that everyone loves to share. Websites actually use terms of use to control how that content, even that funny cat picture, can be used. And in Australia, there's actually been cases where companies have actually gone after individuals for using copyrighted images without permission, all because of what's laid out in their terms of use.
Wow, so there are real-world consequences that makes you actually want to pay attention to what you're agreeing to. But let's be honest, I think most people just click agree without reading a word. So what are some key things we should at least be aware of?
That's a great question. Because even skimming these documents can be really daunting. One of the most important sections is what's called user rights and responsibilities. This is like a roadmap. That outlines what you, the user, are allowed to do on the site. Things like creating an account, posting comments, or even just how you can use the information that you find there.
So like setting boundaries from the start. Hey, you can hang out here, but don't draw on the walls.
Precisely. Another critical section focuses on intellectual property. And this makes it crystal clear that all the cool stuff on the website, the images, the text, the code, belongs to the business. Think of it this way. Imagine you're on a website that lets users upload photos. The intellectual property clause ensures that while users own their uploaded content, the website also has the right to display it, perhaps in a gallery or as part of their marketing.
So it's a balancing act, protecting the website's rights while allowing users to contribute.
Exactly. And here's one that people often miss: liability limitations. This part is all about managing risk for the business. So let's say you download a file from a website, and your computer crashes because of a hidden bug in that file. The liability limitation section might outline how much the website can be held responsible for these issues.
Okay, so they can't be held liable for everything that could go wrong. But isn't that letting them off the hook a little too easily? I mean, some people might say that's giving them a free pass to be careless.
Yeah, that's a valid point. And there's definitely debate about how far those limitations should go. It really is a balancing act between protecting businesses from, frivolous lawsuits, but also ensuring they're still accountable for their actions.
So it's not black and white. There's nuance to these legal documents, which I guess makes them even more interesting.
Absolutely. And just to round things out, there's usually a section about governing law in Australia. This means that any legal issues related to the website would be handled according to Australian law, which keeps things simpler from a legal standpoint.
Makes sense. Now, I'm guessing privacy policies are a whole other beast, right?
You got it. While terms of use are like the house rules, privacy policies are all about transparency and building trust. They detail how a website collects, uses, shares, and protects your personal data. And this is particularly crucial in Australia because of the Australian Privacy Act, which has strict rules about how companies should handle personal information.
So it's like a promise to be responsible with our data. But are companies really being completely open about what they do with our information? It still seems like most privacy policies are kind of buried in fine print.
That's a valid concern, and there's definitely room for improvement. In terms of how companies actually communicate these policies, ideally they should be written in plain language that's easy to understand, not dense legal jargon that just makes your eyes glaze over.
Yeah, transparency in theory is great, but it only works if we can actually understand what we're agreeing to.
Exactly. It's about building a genuine relationship of trust between websites and users. And a big part of that is making sure people feel comfortable with how their data is being used.
All right, so let's dive into the nitty-gritty of privacy policies. What kind of information are we even talking about here? What do these policies actually need to cover?
First and foremost, A good privacy policy needs to be upfront about what data they collect from you. This could be anything from your name and email address to your browsing habits and even your location if you're using a mobile device. And they also need to explain how they plan to use that data. Is it for marketing, improving their services, or something else entirely?
So no more hiding in the fine print. It's about being upfront and honest. But what about sharing our data? Is that something they have to disclose?
Absolutely. If they're sharing your data with anyone else, like advertisers or analytics companies, they absolutely have to be transparent about it. This is about giving you, the user, control over your own information. Think of it this way. You wouldn't want someone reading your mail without your permission, right? The same principle applies to your online data.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we know they're actually keeping our data safe? With all the data breaches we hear about these days, it's kind of scary to think about all this personal information just floating around online.
I hear you. That's a really valid concern. And a good privacy policy will address that head on. They need to outline their security measures. Think of it as like a digital security guard, protecting your valuable information. This could include things like encryption, secure servers, and regular security audits, just to make sure their systems are up to par.
So it's not just about collecting data, it's about taking responsibility for protecting it as well.
Exactly. And finally, a good privacy policy will ensure you have the right to access the data they've collected about you. This means you can see what they know, and even ask for changes if something's wrong, like an outdated address or an incorrect phone number.
So it's about empowering users to be informed and in control of their own data. But let's get real for a second. Do you think most people actually read these policies? I know I'm guilty of just clicking agree without giving it much thought.
Yeah, you're not alone. Most people just don't have the time or the patience to wade through pages of legal text. And that's part of the challenge. How do we make these policies more accessible and engaging? It's not just about ticking a legal box. It's about building a culture of transparency and trust online.
I like that. A culture of transparency. So how do we get there? What can businesses do to make these policies more user-friendly?
Well, for starters, they can ditch the legal jargon and write in plain language that everyone can understand. Imagine if instead of a wall of text, a privacy policy was presented as like an interactive infographic, highlighting the key points in a visually engaging way. Or maybe it could even be integrated into the user experience, popping up with clear explanations at relevant moments.
I love that idea. It's about meeting people where they are
Mm.
and making it feel less like a chore and more like something that's actually relevant to their online experience.
Exactly. It's about making it part of the conversation, not something that's hidden away in the fine print.
Now we've been focusing on Australia. But these policies are relevant everywhere, right? Are there any global trends or best practices that are emerging in this area?
Definitely. Globally, we're seeing a growing emphasis on data privacy and user rights. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, has really set a high bar for data protection, and many other countries are following suit.
So it's not just a local issue, it's a global movement.
Absolutely. And as more and more of our lives move online, the importance of these policies is only going to continue to grow.
Okay, so we've talked about the why and the what of these policies, but let's get practical for a moment. If a business is starting from scratch, what are the first steps they should take to actually get these documents in place?
That's a great question. The first step is to really understand what data you're collecting and why. What information is absolutely essential for you to provide your services or run your business. Once you have a clear picture of that, then you can start drafting your policies.
So it's not just about copying and pasting from a template. It's about tailoring it to your specific business needs.
Exactly. And while there are plenty of resources and templates available online, it's always best to get professional legal advice to make sure your documents are tailored to your specific needs and comply with Australian law. Remember, these policies are legally binding documents, so it's really worth investing in getting them right.
I think a lot of people might assume that these policies are only for big companies with fancy websites.
Yeah.
But is that really true?
Not at all. Even if you're a small business with a simple website, having these policies in place is essential. Remember, every website is a potential interaction point with customers, and those interactions need guidelines.
So it's about setting those expectations
Yeah.
and building trust, no matter the size of your business.
Exactly. And it shows your users that you respect their privacy, which is something everyone values.
So it's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about creating a more ethical and transparent online environment.
I couldn't agree more. It's about doing business the right way, online and offline.
Speaking of doing things the right way, what about companies that get it wrong? What happens if they violate their own policies or mishandle user data?
Well, that's when things can get messy.
Let's dive into that a little more. We'll be right back after a quick break. Welcome back. We were just talking about what happens when companies don't follow their own rules. When it comes to those online policies we were discussing.
Right, because it's one thing to have these policies in place, but it's a whole other thing to actually follow them. That's where the rubber really meets the road. And in Australia, there are some pretty serious consequences for companies that don't meet those standards.
It's not just a slap on the wrist. There are actual teeth to these regulations.
Oh, absolutely. The Australian Information Commissioner, they also call it the OAIC. They actually have the power to investigate complaints and take action against companies that breach the Australian Privacy Act. And we've seen some pretty hefty fines handed down in recent years, especially to those big tech companies, the ones that have mishandled user data.
Yeah, but that gets their attention. I mean, it's one thing to talk about policies,
Yeah.
but it's another to actually see those consequences in action.
Exactly. And beyond those financial penalties, there's also the reputational damage to consider. In today's world, data privacy is a huge concern for consumers. A company's reputation can be seriously tarnished if they're seen as careless or untrustworthy with personal information.
It's like that saying, it takes years to build trust, but only seconds to destroy it, especially in the digital age where news travels so fast.
Right. And consumers have more power than ever before to actually hold companies accountable. With social media and online reviews, negative experiences can spread like wildfire. And that can directly impact a company's bottom line. So it's in everyone's best interest to get this right.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks for companies, but what about us, the users? What can we do to protect ourselves and make sure our data is being handled responsibly? Because honestly, it can feel a little overwhelming and out of our control at times.
I get that. But there are definitely things you can do to be a more informed and empowered digital citizen. First and foremost, be really selective about who you share your data with. Think about it. Do you really need to create an account on that website? Or can you get the information you need without giving up your personal details?
That's a good point. We often just hand over our information without even thinking twice.
Exactly. And if you do need to share your data, take a moment to actually read the privacy policy, at least the key sections. You know, what data are they collecting, how are they using it, and who are they sharing it with?
Yeah, easier said than done. Those policies can be so dense and jargon-filled.
I know. It's not exactly light reading material, but there are resources out there that can help. Websites like the OAIC, they have guides and FAQs that really break down these complex concepts into plain language.
It's about being proactive and educating ourselves.
Exactly. And if you have any concerns or questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the company directly. A reputable company should be transparent and willing to answer your questions about their data practices.
It's about exercising our rights as consumers and demanding that accountability.
Absolutely. And remember, you always have the option to vote with your feet, so to speak. If you're not comfortable with a website's data practices, you can choose not to use their services. There are often alternatives out there.
I love that, putting the power back in the hands of the user.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this fascinating and sometimes overwhelming world of online legalities, what's one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that you have a voice. And you have a choice. You don't have to just passively accept whatever terms and conditions are thrown at you. Take the time to understand your rights. Be selective about who you trust with your data, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
That's a great point. It's about being informed, empowered, and engaged in the digital world. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of website legalities. It might not be the most glamorous topic, but it's certainly one that affects us all. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.
Welcome back. We were just getting into what happens when companies mess up. When they don't follow their own policies.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Because having those policies is just the first step. Actually sticking to them. That's where it really counts. And here in Australia, the consequences can be pretty serious if a company doesn't live up to their promises.
So it's not just a warning. There are real penalties.
Absolutely. The Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC, they have the power to step in, investigate complaints, and even take action against companies that break the Australian Privacy Act. And we've seen some big fines lately, especially for those big tech companies, the ones that haven't handled user data properly.
Yeah, I bet that gets their attention.
It definitely sends a message. It's one thing to have the policies written down, but it's another to actually see those consequences.
For sure. And on top of those fines, there's the whole issue of reputation. These days, everyone's worried about data privacy. So if a company looks careless or like they can't be trusted with information, it can really hurt them.
It's like that saying, it takes forever to build trust, but you can lose it in a second, especially online.
Right. And now it's easier than ever for people to hold companies accountable. With social media and online reviews, word gets around fast. And that can hurt a company's business. So it's in everyone's best interest to do things right.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks for companies, but what about us, the people using these websites? What can we actually do to protect ourselves and make sure our information is being handled properly? Because, to be honest, it can feel kind of overwhelming, like it's all out of our control.
I know what you mean. But there are definitely things you can do to be a smarter and more aware user. First off, be careful about who you give your information to. Do you really need to create an account on that website? Or can you get what you need without handing over all your details?
That's a good point. I think a lot of us just do it automatically.
It's easy to fall into that trap. And if you do need to share your info, at least glance at the privacy policy. Check out the main points. What are they collecting? How are they using it? And who are they sharing it with?
Easier said than done sometimes. Those policies can be so long and complicated.
I know. It's not exactly fun reading, but there are resources out there that can help, like the OAIC website. They have guides and frequently asked questions that explain those complex ideas in plain English.
So it's up to us to do our homework.
Exactly. And if you're not sure about something, don't be afraid to contact the company directly. Any company that's doing things right should be happy to answer your questions.
We have the right to know and to hold them accountable.
Absolutely. And remember, you can always choose to go somewhere else. If you don't like how a company handles data, you don't have to use their services. There are usually other options out there.
I like that. We have the power to decide.
They do.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this whole world of online policies, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to remember that you have a say. You don't just have to accept whatever they throw at you. Take some time to understand your rights. Choose carefully who you trust with your information, and speak up if you have questions.
That's great advice. Be informed, be empowered, and be involved. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been a fascinating look into website legalities. Maybe not the most exciting topic, but definitely important for all of us. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.